stood in the dusty main street of her worn shoes barely touching the ground as the rope tightened around her neck. The crowd had gathered like vultures, their faces twisted with anger and righteousness. She could hear the whispers cutting through the hot August air like knives. "Stealing bread from the general store," someone spat. "In broad daylight, no less." "Should have thought about her children before she became a thief," another voice added. His hands were bound behind her back, but she held her head high. At 28, she had already buried her husband and watched her 3 children grow thin from hunger. The piece of bread clutched in her dress pocket had cost her everything, but it would have fed her youngest for 2 days. The town had no patience for thieves, especially not in 1887 when every family struggled to make ends meet. The drought had lasted 3 months and the crops had failed, but situation was different. She had no family, no support, and no options left. Sheriff Clayton adjusted the noose around her neck, his weathered hands shaking slightly. He had known since she was a girl, had danced at her wedding 5 years ago. But the law was the law, and theft was a hanging offense in their small Wyoming territory. "Any last words?" Sheriff Clayton asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. Looked out over the faces staring back at her. Some showed pity, others showed satisfaction. She recognized most of them. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, who had turned her away when she begged for work. Tom Miller, who had refused to let her wash clothes for food. The banker who had foreclosed on her small cabin just last month. "I only wanted to feed my children," said simply. "If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then so be it." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing through the dusty street. Sheriff Clayton reached for the lever that would open the trapdoor beneath's feet. That's when the sound of horse hooves thundered down the main street. A lone rider approached at full gallop, dust clouds swirling behind him. The crowd turned to see who would interrupt their justice. The horse slowed to a stop just feet from the gallows, and the rider dismounted with swift, confident movements. James stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of years working the land. His ranch sat 5 miles outside of town, and he rarely came to except for supplies. Most people respected him, but few knew him well. He kept to himself since his wife had died in childbirth 2 years ago. "Stop this madness," James called out, his voice carrying across the silent street. Sheriff Clayton paused, his hand still on the lever. "This is none of your concern. The woman is a thief." James walked closer to the gallows, his boots clicking against the wooden planks. "She stole bread to feed her children. Since when do we hang mothers for trying to keep their bobbies alive?" "The law is clear," Mayor Williams stepped forward from the crowd. "Theft is theft, regardless of the reason." James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. The coins inside jingled as he held it up. "How much was the bread worth? 2 cents? 3. "That's not the point," the mayor protested. "If we let one person steal, soon everyone will think they can take what they want." "Here's $5, James said, tossing the pouch to Sheriff Clayton. "More than enough to pay for the bread and any damages. Now cut her down." The crowd began to murmur among themselves. $5 was more money than most of them saw in a month. It was enough to buy supplies for a family for weeks. "She still broke the law," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Money doesn't change that." James turned to face the crowd, his gray eyes scanning the faces. "How many of you have children? How many of you have ever gone to bed hungry?" Several people shifted uncomfortably. The drought had affected everyone, but most still had roofs over their heads and food in their pantries. "Lost her husband to a mining accident last year," James continued. "She's been working odd jobs and selling everything she owned to keep her family together. The bank took her home last month. She's been living in that old abandoned barn outside town with 3 children under the age of 10. Felt tears sting her eyes. She had tried so hard to keep her struggles private, to maintain what little dignity she had left. But James had seen through her pride. "I don't care about her sob story," Mrs. Henderson called out. "She could have come to the church for help." "Could she?" James asked pointedly. "When was the last time this church helped anyone who couldn't pay the collection plate?" The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone knew the truth, even if they didn't want to admit it. The church had turned away more people than it had helped in recent months. Sheriff Clayton looked uncomfortable as he stood beside. The rope around her neck felt heavier with each passing moment. The crowd was growing restless, unsure whether they wanted justice or mercy. "What do you propose?" the sheriff asked finally. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen." James looked up meeting her eyes for the first time. She saw something there she hadn't expected, understanding, compassion, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "I have a proposal," James said, his voice steady and clear. "But first, cut her down. No woman should face death for trying to feed her children." The crowd held its collective breath as Sheriff Clayton hesitated, his hand still resting on the lever that would determine fate. Sheriff Clayton's weathered hand trembled as he slowly reached up and loosened the noose around's neck. The rope fell away, leaving angry red marks on her pale skin. She gasped, drawing in deep breaths of the dusty air that had never tasted so sweet. The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Some people shouted protests while others seemed relieved. James stepped forward and helped down from the gallows platform, his strong hands steady and gentle. "You're safe now," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. His legs felt weak, and she might have fallen if James hadn't been there to support her. She looked into his face, searching for some sign of why he had saved her. They barely knew each other. She had seen him in town perhaps a dozen times over the years, always keeping to himself, always polite but distant. "Why?" she whispered. Before James could answer, Mayor Williams stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You've overstepped your bounds here. This woman committed a crime, and paying for stolen goods doesn't erase that fact." James turned to face the mayor, his expression calm but determined. "You're right. Paying for the bread doesn't change what happened, but I have a solution that serves justice and mercy." "We're listening," Sheriff Clayton said, clearly eager to avoid a hanging if possible. James looked around at the crowd, then back at. "We'll work off her debt to the community. She'll work on my ranch, helping with the household duties and caring for the animals. In exchange, she'll receive food, shelter, and wages for herself and her children." The crowd fell silent again, processing this unexpected proposal. Felt her heart racing, work on his ranch, living under the same roof as a man she barely knew. "That's irregular," Mayor Williams said slowly. "A single woman living on a ranch with a widowed man, people will talk." "People are already talking," James replied firmly. "They're talking about hanging a mother for trying to feed her children. I'd rather they talk about mercy than murder." Mrs. Henderson pushed forward from the crowd, her face pinched with disapproval. "It's not proper. A woman of questionable character working so closely with a respectable man like yourself. Think of your reputation." James's jaw tightened. "His only crime was poverty, not questionable character, and my reputation can survive showing Christian kindness to a widow and her children." Found her voice at last. "Mr. I appreciate your offer, but I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," James said firmly. "It's honest work for honest pay. My ranch is too much for one man to handle alone, especially with winter coming. I need help with the cooking, cleaning, mending, and caring for the livestock. You'd be earning your keep." Doctor, the town physician, stepped forward from the crowd. He was an older man who had delivered most of the bobbies in, including children. "Offer seems fair," he said. "The woman needs work and needs help. It's a practical solution." "But what about appearances?" Mrs. Henderson persisted. "An unmarried woman living on a ranch with an unmarried man." Sheriff Clayton scratched his beard thoughtfully. "What if we arrange proper supervision? Maybe and her children could live in the old foreman's cabin on's property. It's been empty since his last hired hand left." James nodded. "The cabin needs some repairs, but it's sound, and her children would have their own place, their own privacy. She'd work during the day and return to her own home each evening." Felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. Her own home again, even if it was small. Work that would feed her children without requiring her to beg or steal. It seemed too good to be true. "What about schooling for the children?" she asked hesitantly. "The new school teacher starts next month," Doctor said. "Your children would attend with the others." "I still don't like it," Mayor Williams said. "Setting precedents like this could encourage more crime." "No," James said sharply. "Letting people starve encourages crime. Giving them honest work prevents it." A new voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. "I think's right." Everyone turned to see Sam Peters, the owner of the general store where had stolen the bread. He was a thin man with kind eyes who had struggled to keep his business afloat during the drought. "I'm the one who was robbed," Sam continued. And if I'm willing to accept payment and give Mrs. a second chance, I don't see why anyone else should object. The tide was turning, could see it in the faces around her. Some people still looked disapproving, but others were nodding in agreement. The idea of honest work instead of punishment appealed to their practical natures. Sheriff Clayton looked around the crowd one more time, all in favor of accepting's proposal. About half the hands went up. Then Doctor raised his hand, followed by Sam Peters and several others. Soon, more than two-thirds of the crowd was showing support for the plan. "Motion carries," Sheriff Clayton announced. "You're free to accept's offer of employment. The charges against you are dropped in consideration of restitution paid and future service." Felt tears streaming down her face. She turned to James, struggling to find words adequate for what he had done. He had saved not just her life, but her children's future. "Mister, I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Thank me by being the best worker I've ever hired," James replied with a slight smile, "and by giving your children the life they deserve." As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with conversation about the morning's unexpected events, realized her new life was about to begin. She had work, shelter, and hope again, but she also had questions that nagged at her mind. Why had James risked his reputation to save her? What kind of man intervened to save a stranger's life? And most importantly, what would it be like to work so closely with a man who had already shown more kindness than she had received from the entire town? As they walked toward his horse, James seemed to sense her thoughts. "My wife always said that how we treat the weakest among us shows who we really are," he said quietly. "I couldn't let them hang you for trying to be a mother." Nodded, but she suspected there was more to his decision than simple Christian charity. Something in his eyes suggested he understood her desperation in a way that went beyond mere sympathy. Whatever his reasons, she was grateful. For the first time in months, she dared to hope that tomorrow would be better than yesterday. 3 weeks had passed since arrived at the ranch with her 3 children. The old foreman's cabin, which had seemed like a palace compared to the abandoned barn they had called home, was slowly becoming a real home again. Rose before dawn each morning, as she had her entire adult life, but now she woke with purpose instead of dread. She would start the fire in the main house kitchen, prepare breakfast for James, and begin the daily tasks that kept the ranch running smoothly. Her children had adapted to their new life with the resilience that only children possess. 10-year-old Sarah helped with the cooking and washing. 8-year-old Thomas fed the chickens and gathered eggs each morning before school. Little Mary, only 5, spent her days playing near while she worked, chattering constantly and bringing smiles to everyone around her. The work was hard, but it was honest work, and threw herself into it with determination. She mended James's clothes with careful stitches, cooked meals that filled the house with warmth and good smells, and managed the household accounts with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of every penny. James proved to be a fair but demanding employer. He expected excellence in everything, but he also showed appreciation for good work. He never raised his voice, never treated her with anything less than respect, and always ensured she had everything she needed to do her job properly. But was beginning to notice things about James that puzzled her. Sometimes she would catch him watching her children with an expression of deep sadness. When little Mary would run up to show him a flower she had picked, his smile would be genuine but tinged with something that looked almost like pain. One evening, as was cleaning up after dinner, she found James sitting on the front porch, staring out at the pasture where his cattle grazed. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, but his expression was distant and melancholy. "Mister," said quietly, stepping out onto the porch, "is everything all right?" James startled slightly, as if he had been lost in his thoughts. "Yes, of course, just thinking about tomorrow's work," but had grown skilled at reading people's faces during her months of hardship. She had learned to recognize when someone was being polite instead of truthful. "You look sad," she said simply. James was quiet for a long moment, then gestured to the chair beside him. "Would you sit with me for a moment? There are things you should know about why I offered you this job." Sat down, her hands folded in her lap. The evening air was cool, and she could hear her children's laughter coming from inside the cabin where they were playing before bedtime. "My wife, Elizabeth, died 2 years ago during childbirth," James began slowly. "The baby died too, a son. We had tried for 5 years to have children, and when Elizabeth finally became pregnant, we thought our prayers had been answered. Felt her heart clench with sympathy. She had lost her husband to an accident, but she couldn't imagine losing a child she had never had the chance to know. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. James nodded, still looking out at the pasture. "After Elizabeth died, I thought about selling the ranch. What was the point of building something with no family to leave it to? But I couldn't bring myself to let go of the life we had planned together." "That must have been terribly lonely," said. "It was, until the day I saw you standing on that gallows." James turned to look at her directly. "When I saw your children in the crowd, watching their mother about to be hanged for trying to feed them, I saw Elizabeth in your face. I saw the son I never got to raise in your Thomas. I saw the family I had lost." Felt tears stinging her eyes. She had wondered why he had saved her, had suspected there was more to his story than simple kindness. But she hadn't expected something so personal, so painful. "You saved me because I reminded you of your wife?" she asked quietly. "At first, maybe," James admitted. "But these past 3 weeks, watching you work, seeing how you care for your children, witnessing your strength and determination, I've realized something." He paused, as if gathering courage to continue. Waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say would change everything between them. "I've realized that maybe God didn't bring you here just so I could save you," James said. "Maybe he brought you here so you could save me too." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Understood what he was saying, what he was suggesting, but she needed to hear it clearly. "Mr. I." "James," he interrupted gently. "Please call me James." "James," said, testing the name on her lips. "What are you saying exactly?" James stood up and walked to the porch railing, gripping it with both hands. "I'm saying that I care about you and about your children more than an employer should care about his workers." His heart began to race. She had been alone for so long, had focused so completely on survival, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as more than just a widow in need of help. "The town already talks about us," James continued. "Mrs. Henderson makes sure of that, but I don't care what they say anymore. I care about what you say." Stood up slowly, moving to stand beside him at the railing. "What are you asking me, James?" He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious but hopeful. "I'm asking if you might consider staying here permanently, not as my employee, but as my wife. I'm asking if you might consider making this ranch a real home again for both our families." Felt her breath catch in her throat. Marriage. It was something she had never expected to consider again. Her marriage to her first husband had been born of young love and shared dreams. This would be different, a partnership born of mutual respect, shared struggles, and perhaps the possibility of love growing over time. "Your children would have a father," James continued. "You would have security, a real home, a future, and I would have a family again, people to care for, to work for, to build something lasting with." Looked back toward the cabin where her children were getting ready for bed. Sarah was helping Mary with her nightgown while Thomas washed his face in the basin. They had been so happy these past weeks, so much more relaxed than she had seen them in months. "The children do seem fond of you," said thoughtfully. "And I'm fond of them," James replied earnestly. "Thomas is bright and eager to learn about the ranch. Sarah has your strength and kindness, and Mary lights up every room she enters." Turned back to face James. "What would people say? What would the church say?" "The same church that would have let you hang for stealing bread," James asked pointedly. "We don't need their approval to be happy. We need each other's." The evening star had appeared in the darkening sky, bright and steady above the horizon. Had made so many difficult decisions in her life, but this one felt different. This one felt like choosing hope over fear, love over loneliness, future over past. "I need time to think," said finally. "This is a big decision, not just for me but for my children." James nodded understandingly. "Of course, take all the time you need, but know this, whatever you decide, you and your children will always have a home here. Always." As walked back to the cabin that night, her mind was spinning with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Could she really marry again? Could she trust her heart to another man? And most importantly, could she give her children the stable, loving home they deserved? The answers would come, she knew. But for tonight, it was enough to know that someone cared for her, that someone saw her as more than just a charity case or a burden to be endured. For the first time since her husband's death, dared to dream about the future. spent the next week in quiet contemplation, watching James interact with her children, observing how he treated her, and searching her own heart for the answer to his proposal. Each day brought new revelations about the man who had saved her life. She watched him teach Thomas how to rope cattle, his patience endless as the boy fumbled with the lasso again and again. She saw him listening seriously to Sarah's questions about the ranch accounts, treating her 10-year-old opinions with genuine respect. Most touching of all, she witnessed him gently braiding little Mary's hair one morning when was busy with the washing, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. The children had grown to love James without reservation. Thomas followed him around like a devoted puppy, eager to learn everything about ranching. Sarah had begun calling him Uncle James, and Mary had started running to him for comfort when she scraped her knee or needed a hug. But it was the quiet moments that convinced of James's character. The way he always made sure she had eaten before he finished his own meal. How he never raised his voice, even when frustrated with difficult cattle or broken equipment. The respect he showed her opinions when discussing ranch matters, treating her as a partner rather than a servant. On Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after his proposal, made her decision. She found James in the barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal soon. The lantern light cast warm shadows across his face as he spoke softly to the nervous horse, his touch gentle and reassuring. James called softly from the doorway. He looked up, immediately setting down his tools and giving her his full attention. "How are you this evening?" She stepped into the barn, her heart racing but her resolve firm. "I've made my decision about your proposal." James's expression remained carefully neutral, but she could see the hope and anxiety warring in his eyes. "And?" Took a deep breath. "Yes, I'll marry you, James, if the offer still stands." The smile that spread across James's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He stepped toward her, then stopped himself, uncertain of the boundaries in this new territory between them. "The offer definitely still stands," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've made me the happiest man in Wyoming." "I have conditions," said, holding up her hand. "I need to know that this marriage will be a true partnership. I won't be just a housekeeper with a wedding ring. I want to be involved in ranch decisions, in planning for our future." "Of course," James agreed immediately. "I was hoping you'd want to be my partner in every sense of the word." Smiled. "Good, and the children? They come first. Always, they've been through so much, and I need to know they'll always be safe and loved." "They'll be my children too," James said solemnly. "I give you my word that I'll love them and protect them as if they were born to me." Relief flooded through. She had chosen correctly. This man would be good to her children, good to her. "When should we tell them?" "How about right now?" James suggested, "if you're ready." Together, they walked to the cabin where the children were finishing their evening studies by lamplight. Sarah looked up from her arithmetic, Thomas from his reading primer, and Mary from the picture book she was pretending to read. "Children," said, sitting down at the table with them, "Mr. and I have something important to tell you." James pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "Your mother has agreed to marry me. That means, if you're willing, I'll become your stepfather." The children's reactions were immediate and joyful. Mary clapped her hands and laughed. Thomas grinned widely and asked, "Does that mean I can call you Papa?" James felt tears sting his eyes. "I would be honored if you called me Papa." Sarah, always the most thoughtful of the three, looked between her mother and James seriously. "Will you take good care of Mama, and will you love us even when we're naughty?" James reached over and took Sarah's small hand in his larger one. "I promise to take the best care of your mother that I possibly can. And yes, I'll love you even when you're naughty, just like real fathers do." Sarah nodded solemnly. "Then I think it's a good idea." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the parlor of James's ranch house. Doctor performed the ceremony, having been ordained as a minister in his younger days. Sam Peters from the general store stood as James's witness, while Mrs., the Mexican woman who ran the boarding house on the good side of town, stood with. The children wore their best clothes, which had carefully mended and pressed for the occasion. James had bought each of them new shoes in town, a luxury they had never experienced before. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Wore her late husband's mother's wedding dress, which she had kept carefully preserved in her few possessions. It was a bit large, but Mrs. had helped her alter it to fit properly. When James slipped the simple gold band onto his finger, she felt a sense of completion she had never expected to experience again. This wasn't the passionate love of her youth, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a deep partnership built on respect, affection, and shared purpose. "You may kiss the bride," Doctor announced with a smile. James leaned forward and kissed softly, gently, with the reverence of a man who understood the precious gift he had been given. When they broke apart, the children cheered, and even Mrs. wiped away a tear. The first months of their marriage were an adjustment period for everyone. Had to learn to share decision-making after being solely responsible for her family for so long. James had to adjust to a house full of noise, laughter, and the constant activity that came with 3 children. But they worked through each challenge together with patience and communication. Discovered that James was right. She had saved him just as much as he had saved her. The lonely widower had become a devoted husband and father, finding purpose and joy in his new family. The ranch prospered under their joint management. His careful attention to household finances and her practical suggestions improved their efficiency. James's expertise and organizational skills proved to be a perfect combination. The town's initial skepticism gradually gave way to grudging respect. Even Mrs. Henderson had to admit that the family was thriving. The children were well-behaved and well cared for. James seemed happier than he had been since his first wife's death, and had transformed from a desperate woman stealing bread into a respected rancher's wife. 2 years after their wedding, gave birth to James's son. As she placed the healthy, squalling baby in her husband's arms, she saw tears of joy streaming down his face. "Elizabeth would be happy," said softly. "She would want you to be happy." James nodded, unable to speak as he held his son for the first time. Thomas, Sarah, and Mary crowded around to see their new baby brother, their faces bright with excitement. Standing in the doorway of the room where her children played with their baby brother, watching her husband's face glow with contentment, reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the gallows to the altar, from desperation to hope, from loneliness to love. She had been meant to hang for bread, but instead she had found a family, a home, and a love that had surprised them all with its strength and depth. Sometimes the choices that shock the town turn out to be the choices that save lives, heal hearts, and create the families that were meant to be all along. The widowed rancher's choice had indeed shocked the town, but it had also created something beautiful, something lasting, something worth far more than the price of stolen bread. In saving, James had saved himself, and together they had built something neither could have achieved alone, a true home, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow.